Hi everyone. So you should have done your starter task, which was looking at what you understand by interpretations and just gathering those initial thoughts. Because what we need to do in today's lesson is to start to push you to think about some of the skills that you'll be required to demonstrate on this paper, as well as obviously just gathering information. So as we go through the course, as always, we will practice those exam skills. And so if you recall from lesson one, there's two aspects to this exam. The first question will actually be an interpretations question. So you'll be given two interpretations of an aspect of Irish history. It can only be on three possible parts of the course. It can't be on absolutely anything. So there are these depth studies that are picked out in the syllabus. The first one is what we're studying at the moment. It's the early rebellions up to 1803. So you could feasibly get interpretations on the 1798 rebellion, and that's what we're going to start kind of thinking about and focusing on today. But as we go through the course, there are two further possible depth studies where you'd be required to have the knowledge available at your fingertips to do a really good job of analysing and evaluating what historians have said about these events. So effectively we are asking you to operate as though you are a bona fide historian of Irish history, which won't be a problem for you guys at all, I am sure. So initial starter task was just to reflect on what do I understand by interpretations, what is an interpretation in history, because to be honest, as I put my little prompt on there about GCSE, it's probably not something that we focused on a huge amount this year. Hugely important for your coursework, of course. So this is where there is that overlap between this module and what you're doing with either Mrs. Withers or Mrs. Eleanor, because you will be looking at sources and interpretations of Cold War history in order to complete a successful piece of coursework. Right, so of course we've not only got a focus on skills, but we've also got a focus today on a topic, and we are continuing to delve into the history of the 1798 rebellion. So lesson title, what interpretations of 1798 exist? You guys now should have done your storyboard, should have read those information sheets on the causes, the events and the results of 1798. So you should be building up a decent base of knowledge on that. So success criteria for today's lesson: I can define a historical interpretation, so I'm going to talk you through that in a moment. I can summarise the key parts of an interpretation, and we're actually going to look at two today, and I can judge which interpretation I find most convincing and obviously give sound reasons for that. So, stretch and challenge, as always, thinking about your own interpretation of 1798 with your historian's hat on, would you say, from what you know and the information that you've gathered so far in these last few lessons, that the rebellion was political or economic? So it kind of touches, or we touched on that last time as well, I think. So starting to think, well, actually, if you're going to judge an interpretation yourself, there almost needs to be an interpretation of your own, in your own mind, that you can use as a yardstick. So not only are you judging other people's interpretations and gathering those ideas, but then you're starting to form your own original interpretation of what the truth about 1798 really was. Okay, let's move on. So what is an interpretation? Let's have some historians to help us. So we've got Tony McAlevey, first of all, and he says it's a conscious reflection of the past. So it's when you aim to consciously reflect upon what happened and put that into your own words. It's not the ideas and attitudes of the people that were actually involved. An interpretation is not an attempt to put ideas into the heads of those people that actually were involved on the ground in 1798. It's you consciously behaving as a historian and coming up with your own theory. That's an interpretation in history. There's no such thing as a historical truth. You can't say, oh, well, it's definitely, Wolfe Tone definitely thought this as he sailed into Bantry Bay in 1796. Yeah, or William Drennan definitely thought this when he founded the Society of United Irishmen. We don't know. We can only look at the evidence and then put our own reflection on that. We cannot give words to the people who were actually involved. So that's McAlevey's theory. And this one is from Byrom, Council and Riley. And they said it's how people in later times have reconstructed the past and then presented it as their own. We're seeing a lot of this in the news at the moment, aren't we, of course, with all the furore over Black Lives Matters and the pulling down of statues. And, what is British history? And, people reconstruct and present in their own mind what they understand by history. They put their own kind of slant on it. And that's an interpretation, effectively. So interpretations can be ill-advised, can't they? They can be from a position of partial ignorance, of not fully understanding all the events and issues that were there at the time. So a really, really good really, really good interpretation is one where you've tried your best to unturn every stone about what actually happened at that time. You've looked at a wide range of evidence, contrasting evidence, of course. You've come to this as fairly and objectively and open-mindedly as you possibly can. And you've really striven to find out what the truth is. And then you present that. And although you might be convinced it's the truth, it's not. It's still your interpretation of history. It's what you understand. So you as a later person have put your own reflection onto that. So that's an interpretation. So you might want to pause here. Having kind of discussed that, now think, right, okay, so what's my definition? I'm going to define. So get into your notes. And interpretation is, and there we go, off you go. And I'll meet you on the next slide, guys. Okay, so hello again. So still on what is an interpretation. So as I've explained, past has been interpreted in different ways, of course. It depends on who's looking at it. And the exam requires you to assess the strengths and limitations of two interpretations. They will always be from two different historians. An interpretation can't be a primary source, obviously. A primary source is coming from somebody who was there. An interpretation is always a later reconstruction, so it couldn't possibly be a source. They're two different things. So commenting on the provenance of an interpretation is pointless. It's always going to be somebody's opinion. So you don't need to say, oh, this is from a historian, so it'd be their opinion. Well, yeah, of course it is. So now we're into, upper advanced level of history. Don't comment on the provenance. Don't say, oh, well, this one was written in 1993, so therefore they'll think this. No, it's just a later interpretation. So the date and the author doesn't really matter. So what does matter is that you understand which interpretations already exist. So as a historian, you will have looked at sources, you will have studied the events, the causes, the events and results, as we have done. And also, hopefully, you'll have had a chance to study some interpretations that other historians have said. And that way, you come at this with a good base of knowledge for you to make your own judgments. So you apply that knowledge to the topic of each interpretation. Does your knowledge support or attack what the historians are saying? And then finally, you should be able to reach a properly supported judgment as to which interpretation is the most convincing. And note that word convincing. You don't have to wholeheartedly agree with everything that historian says. And in actual fact, I would argue the best answers wouldn't do that, because that doesn't show an awful lot of originality of thought. The best answers would be a historian who could say, actually, I find this part really convincing because of this, because of this, because of this, and you're dropping in your own brilliant knowledge. However, I'm not entirely convinced by this part of the interpretation. I actually think this is a more convincing slant on what happened. So you almost kind of pick and choose from within what really matches your own thoughts and feelings on that. So that's what we're aiming to get you at. That's what you have to be able to do in the exam. So it's operating like a real bona fide historian. So just to recap some of the causes before I set you off looking at interpretation number one. Long-term causes, resentment because of English interference. So we've got the fact that the Grattan Parliament, supposedly had all this legislative independence, but they didn't really, because Westminster could still veto what they said. And you've also got, I've put, the Grattan Parliament of the 1780s, but also think back to lesson one and the wider context of the relationship between the British, or the English, and the Irish, the English and the Scottish, and the Irish, I should say. There's been injustices going back centuries. There's been the subjugation of Irish desires to kind of the desires of the English monarchy. So this kind of resentment about English interference goes back a long, long way. You've also got the plantation of Ulster, so the bitterness that has followed that. So thousands of Protestants since the time of Elizabeth I in the 16th century have been granted estates of land in Ireland, and that land has been confiscated from the Catholics who previously lived there. And by the time we get to the end of the 18th century, we're now generations into that, but the bitterness is still there. The feeling that the Catholics have been unfairly treated and have been removed from the land that's theirs by birthright. The penal laws, so there's still prejudice within the Irish legal system against anybody that's not Protestant Church of Ireland. So Catholics, of course, get the brunt of this, but actually dissenters, so non-Church of Ireland Protestants, also suffer at the hands of the authorities. So there is that kind of sectarian division. It's not as simple as saying it's Catholics versus Protestants, because there are a lot of Protestants, the Presbyterians, who ironically were planted in Ulster in the first place, who also are bitter at the way they're being treated by the English. Okay, and then widespread poverty across Ireland. Ireland has not enjoyed the same development and investment that mainland Britain has done. They suffer as well from a lack of natural resources. So at this time, with the growth of the Industrial Revolution just across the Irish Sea, you've got an issue in Ireland because they don't have coal. And of course, the Industrial Revolution is founded upon steam power. So in the early days, the development of industrialisation, the Irish do okay. They have a flourishing textile industry in the Lagan Valley outside Belfast, because in the early days, industrial factories required water power. Well, Ireland does have hills and fast-flowing streams and rivers, so that was fine. But when the Industrial Revolution moves on to steam power, you need coal to make steam. There are rich seams of coal in the Black Country. Some of you might remember that wonderful trip from year 8 to the Black Country Museum in the northeast. So in England, there are seams of coal ready to be mined. There is no coal in Ireland. It's just a geographical problem. And it's so heavy and expensive to transport, it doesn't make sense to transport huge amounts of coal to Ireland to run factories. They would be uncompetitive. So poverty abounds. They don't have the same industrial development. And rurally, as we've heard, there's a population increase in Ireland, and pressure on land is becoming worse and worse. And because of the inheritance laws, so plots of land in Catholic families have to be split between every single male heir, the plots of land that families are living on in subsequent generations are becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. So you are getting rural poverty, and unlike in England, you can't move to the towns to find work. There isn't work. Industrialisation is not competing, it's not progressing at the same pace. So we've ended up by the end of the 1700s in an island that's starting to really experience rural poverty. And the landlords, of course, are often absentee landlords. They don't have that relationship, that responsibility of looking after the tenants on their land in the same way. And of course, it's not helped by the religious division there. A lot of the landlords are Protestants because of the plantation, and a lot of the tenant farmers are Catholic. So we've got a complicated situation in Ireland which is building up to cause a huge amount of resentment, and it's simmering below the surface in the years running up to 1798. So any of those could be a viable interpretation of why this rebellion broke out. Short-term causes. So what is it that kind of starts to create, increase that tension as we go into the 1790s? We've had the American War of Independence in the 1770s. So we've seen a disgruntled and dissatisfied people, the Americans, break away and using war and violence, escape from the tyranny of George III, of course, who was the monarch at that time, and British rule. And the Irish are thinking, well, if they can do it, we can do it. So they've been somewhat inspired by that. And then, of course, we've got the French Revolution of 1789 and the calls of liberty, equality and fraternity, which echo in the ears of the Irish. So these events are inspiring Irishmen that they can do the same thing. They too can overturn an unpopular king who they feel does nothing for them. You've got the setting up of the United Irishmen in 1791. So they are a group that aim to bring together both aspects of the Christian religion and encourage resistance to the British. You've got William Pitt and his reign of terror. So the laws that he passes in the 1790s to, defeat radicalism springing up in Britain. In some ways, they like the touch paper in Ireland with things like the Unlawful Oaths Act, the Seditious Meetings Act. More resentment. Okay, and finally, the triggers, the things that really lit the touch paper in that particular year. So in 1796, just a year and a bit before the rebellion broke out, habeas corpus was suspended and the leaders of the United Irishmen were arrested. There was a kind of sustained campaign, if you like, by the British government to kind of cut the many heads off the Hydra that was the Society of the United Irishmen. So get all the leaders, get them in. And of course, behind the scenes over in France, Tone was negotiating with the French Directory to launch an invasion. And when he got the yes for that again kind of gave the United Irishmen, the ones that weren't in prison, the rallying cry they needed, that actually, yes, this thing is going to go. So that's a little kind of reminder for you on some of the kind of key interpretations of this rebellion. Who was important? What was it that really started it off? Which key figures played a really important part? Was it all about poverty and economics, or was it about politics? Was it about rebellion against English rule? What's the truth of this? Okay, different people, different historians will have different interpretations. It's up to you to start to come to your own opinion. So now I'm going to shut up, you'll be pleased to know, although I do come back again at the end of this lesson. You're going to watch two contrasting interpretations. So the first one is about 20 minutes long. So it's a documentary all about the rebellion. And the second one's about 15 minutes long. It's another clip from the Story of Ireland, which we've watched part of that before. And as you watch each interpretation, you need to jot down who are the people that are mentioned. Are there any statistics that are mentioned? Is there anything about the economy or numbers of people, anything like that? So what's the kind of facts that particular interpretation has been hung on? Is there any mention of previous events? Are there any clear mentions of causes of the rebellion? I've just given you a quick recap there. So as you're watching it, do any of those things kind of pop up, or even perhaps different ones? As you get to the end of the video clip, because they're video interpretations, just think back and say, God, what was the focus there? Was the focus on religious differences? Was the focus on the politics, the fact that they were fed up with English rule? Was the focus on the economic situation and the difficulties that Ireland was having? It won't just be one. You're not going to get an interpretation that ignores everything else. So it's subtle. At this level, the history you're looking at is a history of subtle differences. It's not going to be a kind of either or, perhaps like you might get at GCSE. So watch carefully, and as you kind of get to the end of it, think, oh, what seemed to be the major focus there? Maybe there was kind of 2 or 3 foci, and you can say, oh, well, they mentioned religion a lot, but they also did mention the economy. So jot them both down. Great. And then final thing, sum up the interpretation in no more than 37 words, and I will know if you've used more than 37, because I actually have an excess words light in my house and it flashes different colours. So just be careful, because obviously that would indicate to me all of your personal details and your addresses. Joke. Right, okay, so you're going to go off and watch some videos. I can imagine, I'm kind of smiling to myself, because I can imagine that if this was Friday, particularly the double lesson with my lot, you'd be so happy that we were watching not one, but 2 videos in this lesson. So it would be one of those joyous occasions when you kind of, yeah, the video's going on. So you've got 2 videos to watch, and then I'm going to talk to you again briefly at the end of the lesson. And then that's today done. So enjoy.